Hi, everyone. We're going to give it a couple more minutes to let people get on, and then we'll begin. So hold tight, and thank you for joining the webinar. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar. It's 2 p.m. now. We're going to give it about another minute so people can join. And just so you know, we will be recording this webinar and sending it out after. So hold tight, and we'll get started soon.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining the webinar, How the Public Charge Proposal Would Harm Immigrant Families and What You Can Do to Stop It. As you know, the Trump administration has put forth a whole host of policies hostile to immigrants, from the travel ban to separating children and families to threatening to build a wall and sending troops to the border. Today, we want to talk about a Trump administration proposal that would make it harder for people seeking opportunity to enter the U.S. or become permanent legal residents. The administration's proposed changes to the so-called public charge test are an affront to our shared values as a nation and a threat to the health and economic security of immigrant women, their families, and their communities. And it's important for all of us to band together and raise our voices to fight back. I'm Amy Matsui. I'm Director of Income Security and Senior Counsel at the National Women's Law Center. Today, I'm joined by some of my amazing colleagues to give you some tools to fight back against this punitive rule. All of us have been working together with the Protecting Immigrant Families, or PIF Coalition, to fight back, and today we want to give you resources and information so that you can join this fight. Today's presenters will include Natasha Chabria, who's a Georgetown Women's Law and Public Policy Fellow at In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Kelly Garcia, Director of Reproductive Justice Initiatives here at the National Women's Law Center. Yesenia Chavez, the Immigrant Women's Health and Rights Policy Analyst at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. Jacqueline Dean, Policy Manager at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. Estelle Mitchell, Income Security Fellow at the National Women's Law Center. and Jenilyn Soto, Senior Manager of Campaign and Digital Strategies at NWLC. Here's what we're going to cover on today's webinar. An overview of the public charge test, what the proposed rule would change, how it would harm women and families. We're going to talk about some top-line messaging, how to take action, and then we'll have some time for folks' questions before we go over next steps in this campaign. We hope that this information will be helpful for you and your clients and constituents. Just want to flag for you, as Candace mentioned earlier, that this webinar will be recorded, and we also are going to send around the PowerPoint, the recording, and some additional materials early, hopefully next week. I also want to flag for you that we will be holding a Spanish language Facebook Live on November 9th at 2 p.m. when we will be providing all of this information in Spanish. And Yesenia, would you mind making the announcement in Spanish as well?
Yes, thank you, Amy. Vamos a hacer este mismo programa en español el próximo viernes a las 2 de la tarde en Facebook y vamos a hablar sobre la carga pública otra vez en español el próximo viernes, que es el 9 de noviembre a las 2 de la tarde.
Thank you. I just want to flag for you that for the question portion of the webinar, we are going to have time for questions, but we can't take them by phone. There is a function on the webinar software where you can submit questions, so please enter your questions in the Q&A function and we'll do our best to answer them at the end. And just to repeat, next week after the webinar is over, we're going to email you links to the PowerPoint, a recording, and some additional resources. So thank you, everybody. We have a lot of ground to cover, so we're going to get started. Natasha from In Our Own Voice is going to kick off the presentation. Natasha, all you.
Thanks, Amy. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Amy mentioned, I work with In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda. Thanks for all of you for attending this critically important webinar. So I'm going to get us started just by situating us in where we currently are in the public charge fight. So what is public charge? Public charge is an inadmissibility determination. So that means that the government is making this consideration whenever someone is an applicant for admission to the United States. So that determination is made at the time of your application for entry to the United States on a visa, or if you're seeking to adjust your status. The current definition of public charge is a person who's likely to become primarily dependent on the government for subsistence. That's material or financial support from the government. Usually when this determination is made, the administrator is taking into account a totality of circumstances. So that's the physical test that they're applying. When they're considering the totality of circumstances, they're considering a number of factors, not just one individually determinative factor. So they can consider things like the person's age, health, family status, education, or if they have an affidavit of support, amongst a whole host of other factors. And just receiving public benefits doesn't automatically make you a public charge. Currently, under the current definition, there's only 2 categories of benefits that are actually considered as part of the public charge test. So it's a pretty narrow scope. Those 2 factors are cash assistance. So those are things like SSI, which is the Supplemental Security Income Benefit, or TANF, which is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Benefit. Also, they'll consider if you are taking advantage of government-funded long-term institutional care. So again, only these 2 public benefits are considered as part of the totality of circumstances test, and neither of them are determinative. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, public charge is an inadmissibility determination. So when does that specifically apply? It applies when you're seeking admission to the United States on a visa. It applies if you're seeking to extend your non-immigrant visa status or change your non-immigrant visa status. So that could be, for example, if you're trying to change from a student visa to an employment-based visa. It also applies when you're seeking adjustment to lawful permanent resident status. So those are when you've heard LPR status or if someone is a green card holder. It's also important to remember that this doesn't apply to all categories of immigrants. So it does not apply to folks who are seeking refugee status, asylum, survivors of domestic violence, such as VAWA self-petitioners, or other protected groups, such as children who have special immigrant juvenile status. In addition, it doesn't apply during the naturalization process. So if folks are seeking to become US citizens, there is no public charge determination during that process. Next slide, please. So I just want to go over the timeline for this entire process. So when an agency is trying to promulgate a new rule, they have to go through a pretty extensive process. First, they have to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking, or an NPRM. So in this case, the NPRM was published in the Federal Register on October 10th. So that's when the official clock started ticking. Then they have to extend a notice and comment period for the public to provide comments to the notice of proposed rulemaking. In this case, we have a 60-day comment period. The clock started ticking on October 10th, so our deadline to submit all of our comments are December 10th. Once the comment period is closed, DHS will review and consider all of the comments. So this is the most important part of the process. This is the time when they're required by law to really consider all of the unique comments that we all submit. And that can be the basis for either modifying the final rule, they can rescind and reissue a new proposed rule, and at the very least, they need to acknowledge the comments in the final rule that they issue. So once all the comments are taken into consideration, a final rule, if there is a final rule, will be published in the Federal Register, the same place that the NPRM is currently published. The rule will become effective at least 60 days after the publication. And another thing I just wanted to flag is that comments are critically important because they can also provide fodder for litigation later on down the line. So if they don't take into account some of our comments, that's something that we can bring to court later on. And finally, I just wanted to flag, and I think we'll keep flagging throughout this presentation, that this is a proposed rule. It's not yet final. So it's really important that we make our voices heard during this comment period. And now I'm going to pass it off to Kelly to take us to the next step.
Great, thank you. So as Natasha said, under the current policy, only cash assistance are considered in making this determination as to whether someone is likely to become a public charge. What we're seeing with this proposed rule is really a dramatic change from that policy that would instead take into consideration the use of critical non-cash benefits that help ensure that people are able to meet basic standards of living. And often these are the types of programs that help people make up the difference between what they are earning in a job and what they really need. And so these benefits, you can see on the slide, they will include SNAP, which is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, non-emergency Medicaid, housing assistance, and Medicare Part D. In addition to expanding the types of assistance that are going to be included, the proposed rule would also introduce really an unprecedented income test in which it would count against someone if they earn less than 125% of the federal poverty line. This is not something that has ever been used before. In addition, it would require that immigration officials making this determination count as a positive factor if someone makes more than 250% of the federal poverty line. And I think people are going to talk later about how the system, this is really trying to put in place a system that favors the wealthy rather than people that are trying to enter the country for opportunities. And finally, the proposed changes are really inherently discriminatory. They would include a set of additional kinds of factors as to whether somebody is a public charge, and they are really problematic factors about individual people. And so first, they're going to look at age. So it counts negatively against you if you are under 18 or above 60, having a disability. English proficiency, so they're looking at whether or not someone speaks English, and also looking at household size. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because other people are going to talk about the ways in which this is targeting particular groups of people and really trying to remake our immigration system into something that favors a privileged few over people that are really looking to come to this country for opportunity. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Yesenia.
Thank you so much, Kelly. So as Kelly was saying, again, currently as it stands, public charge covers cash assistance programs, and what the Trump administration is trying to expand it to is, again, to include non-cash benefits that are non-emergency Medicaid, Medicare Part D, and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, otherwise known as food stamps, and housing assistance. So the way we see this is that an expansion of the public charge determination and definition would essentially force immigrants to choose between their own immigration status or their own well-being or that of their entire family. We believe that public charge goes against everything that reproductive justice represents, and if expanded, will have a detrimental effect on the health and economic security of immigrant, Black, and Latinx, and Asian American and Pacific Islander people, families, and their communities. Something that's really important to note here is that an attack on one family member is an attack on an entire family, because their access to shelter, food, and health care is intrinsically linked to one another. So again, this proposed rule would expand the grounds to include Medicaid, and what we know is that that impact would be detrimental for women who qualify for Medicaid because they may forego family planning, STI treatment, prenatal care, or not seek medical care for their births or the health of their newborn at all. So in that, they would be foregoing all of this care out of fear of negative implications to their legal status. So something else to note here is that children on Medicaid do better in school, and we know they miss fewer days of school due to illness, which therefore makes them more likely to finish high school and college. So again, this rule is really targeting entire families at the end of the day. And we know that this rule is going to force immigrant women to choose between feeding their children, having shelter for their children, or having healthcare access and food and assistance, all for the guarantee of their immigration status. And something to really put into perspective here is that this rule would undermine employment, in that we know that public benefit programs help people, especially in low-wage jobs, to stay employed. So what that means is we know that you can be working in this country full-time on minimum wage and still fall below the federal poverty level, which means that you may be working 40 hours or more a week and still not be lifted out of poverty, and you're working in the hardest jobs, which could be domestic workers, or in retail, or as a fast food worker, and you may rely on support for food and housing security or healthcare access to make ends meet and to get basic necessities that allow you to keep yourself sheltered, healthy, and fed. So I think what we really want to make sure you get out of here is that this rule in decentivizing the use of public benefits is essentially undermining the value of hard work and opportunity and the dignity that these folks deserve, because we know that this rule is not taking into consideration that what it takes to survive in this country on minimum wage. So I think, in addition, I just want to note that we know that individuals who qualify for SNAP or nutrition assistance, which is, again, the largest anti-hunger program in our country, could potentially opt out of receiving food support, all out of fear or ongoing, due to the ongoing threats to their legal status. So I think this shows really how this rule is super dangerous for immigrant women and their entire families. And with that, we can go on to the next slide.
Jacqueline, I think let's turn it over to you.
Thank you, and thanks, Yesenia. My name's Jacqueline Dean. I'm the policy manager at the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. So I just want to speak about why this public charge rule really matters and the impact that it's already had on communities across the U.S. So right now we're seeing a really large chilling effect in immigrant communities who are now fearful of what will happen if they seek out those benefits, even though the rule has not gone into effect. In the course of this year, we've seen a couple of leaked drafts of this rule already in various different forms, and each time that those leaked drafts have come out, we've seen a huge decline in the number of immigrants who are showing up to community health centers for their appointments, or they're requesting that they pay out of pocket and not use their Medicaid benefits because they're scared that doing so will harm their immigration status, even though the rule has not gone into effect. And so this really is a scare tactic by the administration to try and scare away immigrants from using and really taking advantage of the benefits that they're entitled to and that they're currently on. And another thing to note is that because the rule hasn't gone into effect yet, and if it does, it's not retroactive, meaning that if somebody is currently on benefits or has been on benefits before, that will not harm their, that will not put them at risk of being considered a public charge when they apply for their LPR status or their green card, as long as they're not on those benefits at the time that they apply. So it's really important to know. But you know, if you're an immigrant and you're on one of these benefits, you're not going to want to take any of those risks, and you're going to choose to provide for your family instead. So this is the harm that it's already had on our communities. In terms of numbers, we know that millions of people in the U.S. live in households with family members on millions of immigrants live in households with family members who are on at least one of these public benefits, so Medicaid, Medicare Part D, SNAP, and housing assistance. So that includes 3.8 million API immigrants and around 10.1 million Hispanic immigrants. And lastly, this is a clear attack on immigrant women's autonomy. We know that the majority of Medicaid recipients and recipients on these various programs are usually women, and as Yesenia mentioned, an attack on an individual is an attack on an entire family. And a lot of times women are the decision makers in the families and having to choose between their immigration status and putting food on the table or a roof over their family or seeking the reproductive health care that they need. We know which one they're going to choose, and that really hampers their agency and their ability to really thrive in this country that's already making it so difficult for them to access the health care that they really need. Next slide, please. I also think it's important to really highlight how this rule is another form of family separation. In the last year, we've seen, you know, the Trump administration try and separate families at the border, and this current attack on immigrant families, while not as blatant in that it's not physically separating families, it is preventing families from staying together in the form of denying visas and denying status to family members in mixed status families. So if your use of benefits or somebody else's use of benefits is preventing them from staying in the country safely and without fear of having to go back or reapply for their status and not know if that they're going to stay, then that is another form of family separation, and it's instilling a lot of fear in immigrant families. And all of these attacks on our immigrant families that we've seen are just attempts to prevent the permanent settlement of immigrants in the U.S. And the way that they do that is through separating families. And as I mentioned earlier, this is just another one of the many scare tactics of this administration to keep immigrants away from seeking access to healthcare, nutrition, and housing programs that their tax dollars are already going towards. Next slide, please. I also think it's important to mention Kelly had talked a lot about the economic factors and the totality of circumstances and all the other factors that immigration officials will look into in determining if somebody is a public charge. So not only these public benefits that we've been naming, but also what percent of the federal poverty line their income consists of, their health status, whether they're healthy or not, their education level, their family size. And like Kelly mentioned, it's really inherently discriminatory, and it really shows us how much the US and the Trump administration right now is favoring the wealthy, the healthy, and the able-bodied immigrants who they believe are the only ones who should be entitled to stay in this country. And you see that in a lot of their other immigration policies, and this is really just harping on that horrible stereotype, the false stereotype of immigrants as being these people who don't really work hard and rely on health, welfare. Next slide, please. And lastly, we know that millions of immigrants will be affected by this. Around 20 million, or 1 in 4 American children, have at least one immigrant parent. And so this means that many children and that many families could potentially be affected by this rule. It's really hard to tell exactly how many people are going to be impacted just because of all of the different combinations of a person's situation that could make them a public charge. You know, as we mentioned, all of these benefits and all of these other factors such as education and health and income can all play a part in determining whether or not somebody is a public charge. So even if you're not on any of those benefits, but if you have diabetes and a large family and you don't have a college education, you could be deemed a public charge, and you could be at risk for not getting your status. And so it's really hard to really put a number on how many people would be affected. But we know for a fact that because millions of immigrants are living in families in which people are using these benefits, and tons of people are in mixed status families, that this could have such a detrimental effect on a very, very large population of immigrants in the US. And we also know that when one immigrant is forced to be poorer or sicker or hungrier, an entire community is sicker, poorer, and hungrier, and our entire nation will be that way as well. And that the success of our nation really goes in line with, how successful our immigrant communities are. And I will now pass it on to Estelle.
Okay, so now you are hopefully wondering how you can get involved and ensure this rule does not become officially published. So making your voice heard is critical to, stopping. We've been very successful in preventing a lot of the harmful policies put forth by this administration with our strong responses. So to do that, get the information that you need at protectingimmigrantfamilies.org. That website and that coalition has a lot of different resources to learn, about this rule, how to comment, and how to get involved. We encourage you to speak out publicly against the rule on social media using the hashtag #ProtectFamilies. And we can't reiterate this enough, but the comment deadline is December 10th, and I'll get into a bit more on commenting specifically. And then lastly, be sure to contact your representatives and your senators and tell them to publicly oppose this rule. They're uniquely positioned to use their platforms to speak out and put pressure on this administration and to withdraw this rule. So that is absolutely important. Okay, so who should comment? The short answer is everyone. It's so important to note that what you see on the ground is just as important as a statistic. We encourage you to use your voice to and share your perspective, your experiences, and your expertise. So individuals, organizations, community providers, local, state, or national elected officials, and federal officials, as well as local and state officials who run these programs that would be affected. So be sure to, and as Natasha noted earlier, these comments are critically important for litigation down the road. So the more comments we have, the better. Okay, so how to submit comments. There are several different ways to submit a comment. Most obviously is on the federal comment portal, www.regulations.gov, or through a comment microsite. So as I mentioned earlier, protectingimmigrantfamilies.org has a host of resources, as well as a site where you can actually go and use a template or use your own words to submit a comment on behalf of yourself. And then we, the National Women's Law Center, will also have a comment microsite where you can submit your own comments. And then lastly, of course, you can submit your comments by mail and in person, and that address is provided on the slide. Okay, so some comment best practices. We encourage you to submit your comments individually and make them as personalized as possible. So agencies have to count how many comments they receive, and it's really important to have as many comments as possible and to make them as unique as possible. So while we definitely encourage you to look at the templates available at protectingimmigrantfamilies.org or on our website regarding messaging, please try to modify and reflect your own thoughts and your own experiences, because at the end of the day, like those experiences and perspectives are what is most valuable. We recommend that you have a few sentences that reflect your perspective, as specific and concrete and as you can be is important. As I just briefly mentioned, try to submit separate comments. So 3 or 6 or 8 people signing on to one comment together is just one comment. So we encourage you to use your own words and submit individual comments. DHS requires you to use your first and last name when submitting a comment. Any additional information you want to provide is optional. However, if you or someone you know would like to submit a comment anonymously, we recommend that you try to use a friend or representative submit on your behalf, and that friend or representative can acknowledge the relationship in the comment and provide context of that, and the necessity to remain anonymous. So comments are most effective if you take the time to take however much time you have to learn about the proposed rule. It is very complex. So we recommend doing as much background research that you can. Make sure the comment is relevant. So, as I stated earlier, how it affects you, your family, or your community, and being as specific as possible is key. Express your own views. Make statements. Don't ask questions. Don't pose rhetorical questions. Just make definitive, persuasive statements that are written in your own words. And then just to note that comments do need to be submitted in English. And with that, I will turn it over to Jenilyn.
Great, thank you. And again, this is Jenilyn Soto. I'm the Senior Manager for Campaign and Digital Strategies here at the National Women's Law Center. And I, in particular, work with our workplace justice, economic security, and strategic state engagement work. So, what does it mean to engage with people digitally and in person regarding this public charge rule? Well, first of all, why is it important? We know that the Trump administration is trying to dismantle legal immigration with this proposed rule. Again, this is a proposed rule. It's proposed, and we are trying to combat it. We need to tell the Trump administration loud and clear that separating families is wrong, no matter what. And so, in addition to submitting comments to regulations.gov in opposition to the public charge rule, utilizing one of the many templates available to you either through
protectingimmigrantfamilies.org, or the one that we will be providing and going live with later this afternoon at nwlc.org. We want you to utilize your digital and in-person networks to share information and to share stories, which are two key ways that we can support the fight. It's important that we share our stories, especially if we are able, because personalizing the message will add to its impact, both in the substantive comments that are received and that DHS is mandated to review, as well as really moving the hearts and minds of the folks who maybe just don't understand what it means to come from an immigrant family or to be part of the immigration process themselves. So some key engagement tools are social media. PIF, or Protecting Immigrant Families, has toolkits, and each sector lead organization, like those involved in today's webinar, are developing additional tools highlighting specific voices in this fight. So for instance, we will be following up with everyone here on the webinar to share specific sample Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram copy for community members and advocates to use in fighting on behalf of immigrant women, children, and our families. So be on the lookout early next week for our webinar follow-up, as well as the live alert with our microsite. You'll see there, again, the hashtag #ProtectFamilies. This fight is about values. Do we value a nation rich in diversity, opportunity, and access, where families and economies are stronger when together? Hell yes. So, share your values, and if you're able, your family story for why fighting the proposed public charge rule is so dangerous and detrimental. We're going to provide, again, just like we've got template comments, we will be providing some template share copies so that to make it easier for you to lead with your values and share your story. And share critical information. The draft proposed rule is about 447 pages. We don't expect everyone to be an expert in all 447 pages. So we, along with our partners on this webinar, have broken it down as much as possible with talking points, fact sheets, you name it, we got it. It will be online. We've also got a slide later on. And we're gonna make it easy for you to understand this and to share it with your neighbors, your family, and your friends. So this fight, so a couple of other pieces that you can share on social media or add to your social media presence would be op-eds, letters to your local paper editor, and digital and print ads. If you're interested in any of that, or don't know what it means, but it sounds interesting, reach out. You're going to have our contact information as one of the later slides. Sorry about that. As one of the later slides, reach out, and we're more than happy to help you where and when we can. And finally, also using social media, recruit friends and family to submit comments, to share stories, and connect with neighbors and those in their extended networks. Now, I know my slide says engagement and digital strategies, but meeting your community wherever they are, whether it's door knocking, going to the local community center or school, organize a safe space to teach in about public charge and why we need to drive the comments. And finally, a couple of key points on how to engage with your elected representatives. In addition to submitting the comments, it's important that we let our elected representatives, both, from local to state to federal, know that the Trump administration's racist anti-immigrant agenda is circumventing Congress and targeting legal immigration. That's really important. It's a little wonky, but they are going out of their way to screw up our system and to exclude us and our communities. So call and write your elected officials, push them to hashtag #ProtectFamilies at them on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. Lobby them in person. And whether or not they're up for election on Tuesday, you have every right to put this issue in front of them and challenge them to show up for you and for us, because they are your elected officials, and we are all here together to build community. So with that, I'm gonna give it back to Estelle, who will lead us through some of the questions.
Okay, thank you, Jenilyn. And thank you to everyone who has submitted questions so far. We've got quite a few, so we're gonna bear with me, we'll go through those. If you have not submitted a question yet, feel free to do so on the portal software. Okay, so, and then to our panelists, just feel free to jump in if you feel like you can answer this question best. Okay, so this first question talks about the potential unintended consequences of this rule. So this viewer asked, are there other unintended consequences that might sway those who are not disturbed at all by the harmful and very much intended consequences of this rule?
This is Amy Matsui from the Law Center, and I'll kick us off. So one thing that I think it's important to remember is that children are very much impacted by having basic needs, especially when they're very young. So kids who don't have the basics of food, health care, shelter, and income in their houses can have long-lasting developmental, health, educational impacts, and they can't reach their full potential when they don't have what they need to survive and thrive. So when families, as folks mentioned on earlier in the presentation, when one family member loses benefits, the whole family's standard of living goes down, and that includes the youngest members. When we're targeting individual immigrants, we're also limiting our future potential and the ability of children to succeed in school and in their employment and beyond. And so this impacts not just our future workforce and economies, but all of our success together. So I think, this rule is targeting individuals and not thinking about kind of our shared prosperity, especially the future of all of the small people who represent our future. And anyone else who wants to join in, please do.
This is Kelly from the National Women's Law Center. I'd also just want to add that one of the things, following up on what Amy said, one of the things that's really important to think about as we're thinking about what our immigrant communities are, and that I think Jenilyn and others have said, is that when we harm one person we're harming the whole family, and when we harm our families, we're harming our whole communities. And so what we're talking about when we're making it harder for immigrant families to be able to have their basic standard of living, to have the things that they need to succeed, often when we're talking about immigrants who are already in the workforce, right? They are the benefits that we're talking about are benefits that can make up the difference between your job and what you need to have the basic standard of living. And that's really about our system, and not going into details on why our system is rigged, but just to think about how this will harm our communities overall. When we make one set of people poorer, less healthy, we make our whole community poorer and less healthy. And that's bad for everyone. And so I think when I talk about this, I really want to appeal to people's sense of both their respect for other people, but also their sense of what they want the country to look like and what they want their communities that they're living in to be like.
Okay, another question. I think, Kelly, maybe if you also wanted to take this one. Are we thinking about alternative ways to discuss this rule besides public charge?
So, this is Kelly from National Women's Law Center. So I think one, and just generally talking about it, I will say, admittedly, I don't like using the phrase public charge. I really want to talk about this rule and talk about what we're doing in terms of how it's going to affect immigrant families, and how this is really about determinations of how people are able to get status or change their status, or be part of this country. And so that's one of the ways I want to flip it, so that we're not just talking about public charge. Public charge itself, I feel like, is inherently problematic as a term. And so trying to kind of avoid that as you're talking about that. And again, really trying to talk about what this means. What kind of country do we want to live in? What kind of country, what kind of community do we want to live in? And centering the people that are going to be most affected by this rule. Do others want to jump in on that?
This is Yesenia from the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. I think one way to think about this rule is that, really taking into consideration what was talked about earlier about favoring the wealthy. I think that's a really a more accessible lens to talk about this rule in. We know that this rule is trying to put a monetary value on an immigrant's worth and their ability to stay in this country with their families. And we know that that's like inherently problematic. And I think, as you all saw over this summer, so many people came out of the woodwork to defend and just proclaim their opposition to the family separation policy that the administration embarked upon the border. And I think what we need to keep in mind here is that this is a new form of family separation. And I think the more that we talk about public charge in this way, the more accessible it is for people to understand it's about keeping families together in this country, especially given that there's a majority of mixed status families that are going to be targeted here, with folks who may have someone, either a parent or a family member who is undocumented or maybe has a different immigrant legal status, and with U.S. citizen children. So we're looking at entire families being impacted, and their access to food, shelter, and housing is all, impacts all of them. So family separation is a different lens to look at this issue through as well.
Okay, great. And someone asked how many comments have been submitted thus far, and if we're able to make it to the goal of 100,000. Yeah, so I will take this one. As I said earlier, it's really important to submit as many comments as possible. Right now, as of Monday, there have been 30,259 comments submitted, which is and we still have well over a month left to submit comments. So we absolutely, I think, it is definitely possible to meet that goal if everyone engages with their communities and, works to submit as many comments as possible. Okay, and so some folks are also asking what can be done after submitting a comment. So other ways to get engaged.
Actually, before that, no, this is Jenilyn. I'm gonna go ahead and answer that. After submitting your own comment, you should make sure that you connect with your parents, your siblings, your children, your aunts, your uncles, your grandmas, your grandpas, your neighbors, your coworkers, everyone possible to submit their own comment. It is so critically important that we do more than just submit our own comments, that we hold our communities, our families, our friends accountable to submitting their own comments and sharing their stories. And then in addition to that, you can also call, write, visit your elected representatives at the local, state, and federal levels. If you want to, you can also, again, draft an op-ed, write a blog, call attention to the issue of this proposed rule and the dismantling of the legal immigration system, and that you continue to share stories and information about how we can protect families.
This is
Okay,
Jacqueline from.
Go ahead. Sorry, Jacqueline.
This is Jacqueline from National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. I think something else that we can do after the public comment period ends is to continue to use this opportunity to bring awareness in to all of the restrictions that immigrants face in trying to access healthcare. There are already so many restrictions on which benefits that immigrants can face, and it needs to be a continued conversation so that we can push our members of Congress and our senators and our other representatives at the state level to continue expanding access to healthcare for immigrants instead of just fighting back the bans and the restrictions and just public charge, and that this is a continuous fight in which we always need to push for something better and to really lift the bans that are already in place that really limit immigrant access to healthcare.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is Natasha from In Our Own Voice. I just want to highlight that there's a lot of creative ways to really get engaged in your community. So I've seen a lot of folks hosting comment writing parties where they'll get their friends and family together, bring some pizza over, do some research, and talk about how to best engage in this. So it doesn't just need to be a solo activity. This can be something that you really get excited about and get creative about.
And this is Yesenia with the National Latina Institute again, and I just wanted to say that if we have any health providers on the call today, I think something that's really critical here is to make sure your patients feel welcome and understand that eligibility to any of these public benefit programs has not changed, and that public charge will take some time. Hopefully it's never implemented. This expansion, this proposal is never implemented, but just to really emphasize that this is going to take a long time, and that folks can currently still use these public benefit programs, and that their access to food, housing, and healthcare is what's right now something that could critically support their families in this country.
Great, thanks, Yesenia. So I wanted to thank you all again for submitting your questions. I wish that we had time to answer all of them. I did want to flag for you an important resource on the protectingimmigrantfamilies.org website is their frequently asked questions page, which can address a lot of the questions I saw on this portal, and any other questions you may have not thought of, So please be sure to check that out. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy, who will wrap us up.
Thank you, Estelle. I think that what we've been trying to make clear and what we all know on this webinar, whether we're presenting, listening, or know someone who could benefit from this, is that as we know, all of us have an immigration story, and immigrants are our neighbors, our family members, our friends in our school and our workplace and our communities. And we are all stronger when we thrive together. So that's why it's so critically important to have everybody's voice in this fight and to have everyone joining together. And we're so grateful that you're helping us do that. I wanted to flag some very important next steps to keep in mind as we fight back against this punitive rule. So just as a reminder, the deadline to submit comments to the federal rule is December 10th. There are two kind of main ways that we want to encourage you to think about commenting. One, as we've talked about a little bit on this webinar, individuals can send in individual comments, and the microsites on Protecting Immigrant Families and the National Women's Law Center will give you a template that you can use to help frame your story and your personal information so that you can send in your comments as an individual. And we hope that all of you and your families and your networks will take that opportunity. For those of you who are advocates and partners belonging to organizations, I also wanted to flag for you that the coalition partners are trying to develop template comments that you can use to help your organization weigh in. Sometimes it's hard for an issue that might not be your core competence. You want to provide your expertise, but you also want to make sure that you're commenting in a way that's helpful. And so template language is going to be provided and available to you. If your organization is interested in submitting a comment, please reach out to one of us, of the presenters, and we will make sure that you're connected with that template language. So just to reiterate, you can submit comments as an individual, and organizations can also submit comments. And those are two ways that we hope everyone on the call will weigh in with the administration. Second, for the Spanish-speaking community, there's going to be a Facebook Live on November 2nd at 2 p.m., which provides all of this same information to make sure that that's accessible. And as we've mentioned a couple of different times, just a few, we want to make sure you're connected with the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign. There's a very broad range of organizations that has information from, we have covered here women, immigrants of color, the health care, kind of the impact of health care, but there's information which affects, food security, labor, the LGBTQ community, survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. Kind of all of those impacts and organizations are represented in the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition, as well as super expertise on immigration above and beyond that connects all of those pieces. So we really encourage you to consult that resource. And then finally, we wanted to highlight the theme week, which the coalition has organized on November 26th to highlight the women's community, the LGBTQ community, progressives more broadly, and labor, to have that be kind of a highlight and focus on the impacts and themes on all of our different communities. So with that, we hope that we've been able to leave you with information that you can use to move forward. We're going to send an email out to everyone who registered for this webinar that provides the PowerPoint, a recording of the webinar, some additional resources and links, and we hope that this will enable you to fight back against this terrible proposal. Our contact information and the websites of our organizations are on the last slide. And so I want to thank you so much for your time today, and I want to thank especially all of our partners and presenters on the webinar. And with that, we're going to conclude today's webinar. Thank you.